2,000 years ago, a book about giants who dreamed of their own destruction was sealed inside desert caves and then erased from history. Its fragments resurfaced in Judea, echoed again in distant Central Asia, and quietly vanished from every canon that shaped the modern world. Who preserved it? Who ignored it? And why was it left behind while others were declared sacred? The surviving ink is real. The silence around it is louder. Parchment fragments catalogued in the Judean desert. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds near Qumran discovered jars containing ancient scrolls in a limestone cave overlooking the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The site lay roughly 1 mile inland from the water and about 13 miles east of Jerusalem. Within months, fragments and scrolls reached antiquities dealers in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Eleazar L. Sukenik of the Hebrew University purchased several scrolls in November 1947 and identified their antiquity through paleographic comparison with known Hebrew scripts. Around the same period, John C. Trevor of the American Schools of Oriental Research photographed additional scrolls at St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem. These images were later compared with known biblical manuscripts and dated to the late Second Temple period, approximately the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE. Systematic archaeological excavation began in 1949 under the direction of Roland Deveau of the École biblique et archéologique française. Between 1949 and 1956, 11 caves near Qumran yielded thousands of fragments written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Cave 4, discovered in 1952, produced the largest concentration of material. Its fragments were not preserved as complete scrolls but as thousands of pieces scattered across the cave floor. Many were brittle, folded, and darkened by age. Among these cave, 4 fragments were Aramaic manuscripts later associated with what scholars now call the Book of Giants. The designation 4Q203, 4Q530, 4Q531, 4Q532, and 4Q533 refers to specific catalogue numbers assigned during editorial classification. The prefix 4Q indicates Cave 4 at Qumran. These numbers do not indicate a single intact manuscript. They represent separate copies or fragments that preserve overlapping portions of similar narrative material. The official inventory was maintained by the Jordanian Department of Antiquities in the 1950 and later integrated into the Israel Antiquities Authority collections. The text itself survives only in fragmentary form. The language is Aramaic. Paleographic analysis places the handwriting of these fragments between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century BCE. Joseph T. Milik first identified several of these fragments as belonging to a composition related to Enochic literature. His conclusions appeared in articles during the 1960s and were later consolidated in his volume, The Books of Enoch, Aramaic Fragments of Qumran Cave 4, published in 1976. Milik grouped the fragments with other Enochic writings because of shared names and narrative elements. The connection rested on internal textual parallels rather than external titles, since no fragment preserves a full heading. The name Book of Giants was not originally derived from Qumran. Earlier evidence existed in Central Asia. Between 1902 and 1914, German expeditions to the Turfan Oasis in present-day Xinjiang recovered Manichaean manuscripts written in Middle Persian, Parthian, Sogdian, and other languages. These expeditions were led by scholars such as Albert Grunwedel and Albert von Lecoq under the Prussian Academy of Sciences. Among the recovered texts were fragments describing antediluvian giants and a figure identified with Enoch. These Manichaean fragments were studied and published in parts during the early 20th century. The narrative preserved there included named giants such as Ohia and Hahia, names later recognized in altered Aramaic forms in the Qumran material. When Qumran fragments were examined in the 1950 and 1960, scholars noticed linguistic correspondences between the Aramaic names and the names in the Turfan manuscripts. The parallels were not complete, and many readings remained uncertain due to damage. However, the overlap was sufficient for Milik and later scholars to associate the Qumran Aramaic fragments with the Manichaean Book of Giants. This association suggested that the Qumran text represented an earlier Jewish version of a narrative later transmitted and adapted within Manichaeism. The fragments from Qumran do not form a continuous narrative. They preserve speeches, dream reports, and references to giants who describe troubling visions. Several fragments mention Mahaweh, a figure also known from Manichaean sources. Other names appear in damaged form but align with the Genesis 6 account of giants, also known as the Nephilim. The Aramaic script and orthography match other Second Temple period texts found at Qumran, confirming their chronological placement. Radiocarbon dating performed on selected Dead Sea Scroll samples in the 1990 supported paleographic estimates, placing many manuscripts between 200 BCE and 50 CE. Editorial work on the Book of Giants continued into the late 20th century. Lauren T. Stuckenbrook published The Book of Giants from Qumran in 1997, providing transcriptions, translations, and analysis of all known fragments. His edition incorporated improved readings based on infrared photography and more precise fragment joins. Stuckenbrook identified recurring themes, including divine judgment, the activity of fallen angels, and communication between giants and Enoch. The edition relied on previously unpublished fragments that had remained in editorial backlog during earlier decades. Physical reconstruction required attention to fiber patterns and parchment thickness. Scholars matched torn edges to identify joins. Some fragments were physically reassembled, while others were grouped based on script similarity. The official Dead Sea Scrolls publication series, Discoveries in the Judean Desert, provided authoritative editions of many Cave 4 texts. The Book of Giants fragments appear across volumes published between the 1000, 980, and early 2000. Each entry includes plate photographs, transcription, and textual notes. Access to the fragments expanded significantly in the 21st century. In 2012, the Israel Antiquities Authority launched the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, providing high-resolution images and catalogue metadata. Entries for 4Q, 203, and related fragments list material as parchment, language as Aramaic, and script as Hasmonean or early Herodian formal. The digital interface allows scholars worldwide to examine the ink traces directly. The Book of Giants remains defined by its fragmentary condition. No complete manuscript has survived. Identification depends on comparative philology, paleography, and historical analysis. Its existence at Qumran is documented through physical fragments discovered between 1947 and 1956, catalogued in the mid-20th century, and published gradually over several decades. Its earlier Manichaean form was preserved in Central Asian desert caves and documented by German expeditions beginning in 1902. Manuscripts in transit between Turfan and Berlin. The route that preserved the title Book of Giants did not begin along the Dead Sea. It passed instead through the dry basins of the Turfan Depression in present-day Xinjiang, where layers of abandoned settlements yielded manuscripts in multiple scripts and languages. Between 1902 and 1914, 4 German expeditions sponsored by the Königliche Museen zu Berlin and the Prussian Academy of Sciences travelled through Central Asia under the leadership of Albert Grunwedel and later Albert von Lecoq. Their work focused on Buddhist cave complexes near Turfan, but among the recovered materials were Manichaean texts written on paper and parchment in Middle Persian, Parthian, and Sogdian. The Manichaean religion, founded in the 3rd century CE by Mani in the Sasanian Empire, incorporated earlier Jewish and Christian traditions into its cosmology. Mani's own writings referred to earlier revelatory literature, including narratives associated with Enoch. Within the Turfan cache, fragments describing giants and their dreams were identified as part of a Manichaean composition known in scholarship as the Book of Giants. These pieces were not complete codices. They were loose leaves and fragments, sometimes charred or torn, preserved in the arid climate of the region. Albert von Lecoq published portions of these discoveries in the multi-volume series Die Buddhistische Spätantike in Mittelasian between 1922 and 1933. Although the series title refers to Buddhist antiquity, it included Manichaean material recovered in the same expeditions. Editors recognized recurring names such as Oya and Haya within the fragments. The language reflected Middle Iranian forms rather than Semitic originals. Script analysis indicated that the manuscripts dated from the 8th to 10th centuries CE, long after Mani's lifetime, but within the period when Manichaean communities were active along the Silk Road. Parallel research in St. Petersburg involved collections assembled by Russian expeditions. The Russian Turkestan expeditions, led by Sergei Oldenburg and others at the turn of the 20th century, recovered additional Manichaean fragments. These were later housed in the Institute of Oriental Manuscripts of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Some of the St. Petersburg material overlapped thematically with the Berlin holdings, preserving passages about antediluvian giants and heavenly messengers. Publication was gradual, often limited by linguistic complexity and geopolitical disruption. Scholars analysing the Turfan manuscripts identified structural similarities to Enochic traditions known from Ethiopic and other sources. Mani's adaptation appears to have drawn on Jewish texts circulating in the Near East during late antiquity. The Manichaean Book of Giants was composed in Syriac, according to scholarly reconstruction, and then translated into Middle Persian and other languages as Manichaean communities expanded eastward. Fragments in Middle Persian and Sogdian preserve narrative sequences in which giants recount dreams, seek interpretation, and receive communication associated with Enoch. The connection between these Central Asian texts and the later Qumran fragments emerged only after the Dead Sea Scroll discoveries. Joseph T. Millick noted correspondences in names and narrative motifs in the 1960s. Lauren T. Stukenbrook later documented linguistic parallels in his 1997 edition of the Qumran Book of Giants. The Aramaic fragments from Cave 4 include names that resemble those in the Manichaean material, though spelling reflects different phonetic systems. For example, forms corresponding to Ohia and Hahia appear in damaged Aramaic lines, suggesting continuity across centuries of transmission. Archival records in Berlin provide detailed inventories of the Turfan finds. The Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities maintains catalogue numbers that trace fragments to specific expedition seasons. Many manuscripts were damaged during the Second World War when parts of the Berlin collection were destroyed or displaced. Surviving materials are preserved in the Museum für Asiatische Kunst. Modern conservation efforts include multispectral imaging and digital archiving to stabilize and document fragile pages. Philological study of the Manichaean fragments requires expertise in Middle Iranian languages. Editors such as Werner Sundermann and Walter Bruno Henning contributed to deciphering the script and reconstructing narrative content during the mid-20th century. Their work established that the Manichaean Book of Giants did not represent a simple copy of a Jewish text. Instead, it adapted earlier traditions into Mani's dualistic cosmology. Even so, the presence of shared character names allowed scholars to posit a common source predating Mani. The transmission pathway suggests movement from a Jewish Aramaic composition of the Second Temple period to a Syriac intermediary text in late antiquity, followed by translation into Middle Persian and Sogdian. Direct manuscripts of the Syriac version have not survived. Reconstruction depends on comparative analysis of the Iranian fragments and the Aramaic pieces from Qumran. Differences in narrative sequence indicate editorial reshaping during Manichaean redaction. Documentation of the Turfan discoveries appears in expedition reports and academic publications spanning the early 20th century. Albert Grünwedell's preliminary reports and von Lecoq's illustrated volumes provide facsimiles and photographs of many fragments. Russian scholarship in St. Petersburg supplemented these editions with parallel materials. Later summaries appear in works such as Werner Sundermann's studies of Manichaean literature and Stuckenbrook's examination of Enochic traditions. Preservation conditions in Turfan differed from those at Qumran. The Central Asian manuscripts were often written on paper rather than parchment, reflecting regional scribal practice. Climate and burial context influenced survival. In both regions, arid conditions limited biological decay, but human disturbance and handling introduced additional damage over time. Conservation protocols in Berlin and St. Petersburg now regulate temperature, humidity, and light exposure. Digital initiatives in recent decades have expanded access to these materials. The Berlin Turfan collection has digitized portions of its holdings, making images available to researchers worldwide. Cross-comparison between Turfan and Qumran fragments now occurs through online databases and collaborative projects. The Manichaean Book of Giants remains preserved only in fragmentary witnesses, Yet archival documentation allows a traceable line of custody from excavation sites in Xinjiang to museum storage rooms in Europe and Russia. The Enochic framework within Second Temple Judaism. Within the broader manuscript collection discovered near Qumran, the Book of Giants does not stand alone. It belongs to a cluster of Aramaic compositions centered on the figure of Enoch. These works, preserved in multiple caves, reflect a sustained literary tradition active during the late Second Temple period. The Aramaic Enochic corpus includes texts commonly identified as the Book of Watchers, the Astronomical Book, the Book of Dreams, and the Epistle of Enoch. Portions of these writings survive in Cave 4 fragments, catalogued separately under distinct numbers, yet paleographic and linguistic similarities indicate shared transmission history. The Astronomical Book, represented in fragments such as 4Q208 through 4Q211, contains calendrical calculations and descriptions of celestial movements. Its script style and orthographic conventions align with those of the Book of Giants fragments. Both employ formal Aramaic script characteristic of the Hasmonean period. Radiocarbon dating of select Aramaic manuscripts from Qumran supports placement between the 3rd and 1st centuries BCE. The consistency and scribal execution suggests that these compositions were copied in similar institutional settings. The Book of Watchers, attested in 4Q201 and related fragments, narrates the descent of the Watchers and their interaction with humanity. Its thematic content overlaps with the Book of Giants in its treatment of pre-flood transgression. The Watchers' offspring, described in Genesis 6 as giants, receive expanded treatment in the Book of Giants. Although no continuous scroll unites these compositions, shared names and motifs indicate that they circulated together. Editors such as Joseph T. Milik and later George W. E. Nickelsburg have argued that the Aramaic Enochic texts represent earlier stages of a tradition later preserved in Ethiopic translation. The Ethiopic version of 1 Enoch, transmitted through the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, preserves complete narratives that parallel portions of the Aramaic fragments. Comparative study reveals that the Book of Watchers in Ethiopic contains expanded speeches and interpretive commentary absent from the fragmentary Aramaic remains. The Book of Giants does not survive in Ethiopic form. Its narrative is known primarily through the Qumran Aramaic fragments and the Manichaean adaptations recovered in Turfan. The absence of an Ethiopic witness distinguishes it from other Enochic works. Manuscript distribution at Qumran indicates that Enochic literature held a defined place within the community's textual repertoire. At least 11 copies of the Book of Watchers have been identified among the caves. The Book of Watchers, the presence of multiple copies of the Astronomical Book and the Book of Dreams, further confirms sustained copying activity. Lauren T. Stuckenbrook notes that at least 6 manuscripts preserve portions of the Book of Giants. The multiplicity of witnesses suggests that these texts were valued and recopied, rather than stored as singular artifacts. Language choice provides additional context. While many Qumran biblical manuscripts are written in Hebrew, the Enochic texts, including the Book of Giants, are composed in Aramaic. This linguistic pattern reflects broader trends in Second Temple Judaism, where Aramaic functioned as a lingua franca across Judea and neighbouring regions. The Genesis Apocryphon, another Aramaic work found in Cave 1, demonstrates similar narrative expansion of biblical material. The shared language and narrative technique position the Book of Giants within a recognizable literary environment. Editorial analysis of the Enochic corpus often relies on structural comparison. The Book of Watchers presents a sequence in which the Watchers petition Enoch to intercede on their behalf. In the Book of Giants fragments, giants consult one another and refer to communication associated with Enoch. Although the fragments do not preserve full narrative arcs, thematic parallels are documented through shared vocabulary and character roles. Scholars avoid harmonizing the texts beyond what the fragments allow, yet comparative evidence supports a common conceptual framework. The Qumran community's interest in apocalyptic themes is evident across multiple compositions. The War Scroll, preserved in 1 QM, outlines eschatological conflict in Hebrew. The Aramaic Enochic texts address cosmic order and divine judgment from a different angle. Together, these writings demonstrate engagement with questions of heavenly authority, angelic mediation, and the fate of transgressors. The Book of Giants fits within this spectrum without presenting independent doctrinal innovation. The Discoveries in the Judean Desert publication series documents the Enochic fragments with diplomatic transcription and plate photography. Volume 1 included early releases of Cave 1 material, while later volumes addressed Cave 4 Aramaic texts. Each edition situates the fragments within the broader manuscript inventory. The editorial apparatus notes paleographic dating, orthographic variation, and parallels to Ethiopic 1 Enoch, where applicable. Scholarly discussion of the Enochic framework extends beyond Qumran. The Greek fragments of 1 Enoch discovered in Egypt during the 19th century, particularly those from Akhmim, provide additional comparative data. R.H. Charles published translations of Ethiopic 1 Enoch in 1912, drawing attention to its composite nature. Subsequent research by James C. Vanderkam and George W. E. Nicolsburg has clarified the developmental stages of Enochic literature. Within this scholarly landscape, the Book of Giants represents a component preserved only in partial form, yet anchored in the same tradition. Archaeological context reinforces literary classification. Cave 4's proximity to the Qumran settlement suggests intentional storage. Ceramic analysis and stratigraphic study conducted by Roland Deveau linked the caves to the nearby communal complex. Although debates continue regarding the precise identity of the Qumran community, manuscript content reflects structured textual preservation. The inclusion of multiple Enochic works indicates that these writings were integrated into the collection rather than marginal additions. Modern digital archives facilitate cross-text comparison. The Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls digital library provides synchronized access to images of Enochic fragments. Scholars can examine letter forms and compare orthographic features across manuscripts. Digital concordances assist in identifying recurring names and formulae. Such tools support continued refinement of textual relationships within the Enochic corpus. Names, dreams, and speech within the surviving lines. Across the preserved Aramaic fragments attributed to the Book of Giants, a limited number of personal names recur with measurable consistency. These names appear in damaged lines, often without narrative framing, yet their repetition allows scholars to identify characters and thematic movement within the text. The fragments do not present a continuous story. They preserve dialogue, reported dreams, and references to actions already in progress. What survives are voices speaking from within a larger account. Among the clearest names in the Qumran material are forms corresponding to Mahaway, Ohia, and Haya. These spellings vary according to reconstruction and paleographic interpretation. Lauren T. Stuckenbrook's edition of the Qumran Book of Giants, 1997, transcribes several fragments in which Mahaway appears as a messenger figure. In 4Q 530, for example, a line preserves a partial reference to Mahaway travelling or being sent. The broken condition of the fragment prevents full contextual restoration, yet the name is legible enough to connect it with the same figure preserved in Manichaean Middle Persian fragments from Turfan. The giants speak in the first person in some passages. Fragments contain verbs indicating seeing, dreaming, and recounting. One damaged line in 4Q 203 preserves part of a speech in which a giant describes a dream that causes distress. The text includes the Aramaic root for to see, consistent with dream narration formulae found elsewhere in Second Temple literature. Unlike later elaborated traditions, the Qumran fragments present these dreams in concise, direct speech without explanatory commentary embedded in the surviving lines. Names associated with Genesis 6 traditions also appear in related Aramaic literature from Qumran. Although the Book of Giants fragments do not quote Genesis directly, they assume familiarity with the tradition of the sons of God and the birth of giants. Milik argued that the Book of Giants expands the Genesis account by focusing on the giants' response to impending judgment. That argument rests on internal textual references to punishment and destruction preserved in partial lines. The fragments mention tablets, writing, and messages delivered through Enoch. Enoch's presence in the surviving text is indirect but consistent. Several fragments refer to communication addressed to or from Enoch. In 4Q 530, a line preserves the phrase, "the scribe Enoch," though the surrounding text is incomplete. This designation aligns with Enoch's role in other Aramaic Enochic compositions found at Qumran, including the Astronomical Book and the Book of Watchers. George W. E. Nicolsburg's commentary on 1 Enoch notes that Enoch is frequently depicted as a mediator who records divine decrees and conveys them to heavenly or earthly recipients. The Book of Giants fragments reflect that broader tradition without preserving a full narrative framework. Speech patterns within the fragments demonstrate alternating speakers. Some lines introduce direct address with verbs meaning said or spoke. Others preserve imperative forms, suggesting command or instruction. The giants appear to consult one another regarding their dreams. In certain fragments, plural verb forms indicate collective action. The grammar confirms that more than one giant participates in dialogue. This internal evidence aligns with Manichaean fragments in which giants assemble to interpret visions. The Qumran Aramaic fragments also contain references to a written message. One damaged passage appears to describe a tablet or written decree sent from heaven. The word for tablet, although fragmentary, matches Aramaic terminology used in other Dead Sea Scroll texts to denote inscribed objects. Scholars have compared this with 1 Enoch 13, where a written petition is carried to Enoch. The Book of Giants fragments preserve only partial wording, but the structural similarity suggests a shared literary environment rather than a direct quotation. Differences between the Qumran and Manichaean versions are measurable. In the Turfan fragments, the giants' dreams are sometimes elaborated with cosmological imagery consistent with Manichaean dualism. The Aramaic fragments from Cave 4 lack such developed cosmological vocabulary. Their terminology reflects Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic style, rather than later Iranian dualist theology. Stuckenbrook emphasizes that the Qumran text represents an earlier stratum of the tradition. That assessment is based on linguistic features and the absence of Mani's distinctive theological markers. Several fragments mention trees or plants in dream imagery. The surviving words correspond to Aramaic terms for vegetation. Interpretation remains limited because adjoining lines are lost. In Manichaean parallels, giants dream of trees uprooted or destroyed, symbolizing judgment. The Qumran material preserves only isolated references without full interpretation. Editors refrain from inserting missing narrative segments beyond what the ink traces support. Philological analysis of the Aramaic demonstrates consistency with other Qumran compositions. Orthography shows matres lectiones usage typical of late Second Temple Aramaic. Letter forms match Hasmonean formal script characteristics described by Frank Moorcross. These technical details confirm that the text belongs within the broader corpus of Aramaic works discovered in Cave 4. The language does not reflect later Syriac transmission stages that appear in Manichaean intermediaries. The fragmentary condition of the manuscripts limits narrative sequencing. Scholars arrange fragments into hypothetical order based on thematic coherence and physical joins. In 4Q 531, a partial sequence suggests that a dream report is followed by consultation among giants, then by reference to Enoch. This reconstruction depends on adjacent fragments whose fibers align. Other fragments cannot be securely placed within that sequence and remain isolated. Interpretive restraint is evident in critical editions. Editors mark uncertain letters with dots beneath characters and enclose reconstructed words in brackets. This convention ensures transparency. The Dead Sea Scrolls publication guidelines require that conjectural restorations be clearly indicated. As a result, modern readers encounter the Book of Giants primarily through transcriptions that display textual gaps. The incomplete state is part of the documented record. The role of Mahaway appears central in both Qumran and Manichaean witnesses. In the Middle Persian fragments published by Walter Bruno Henning in 1943, Mahaway travels to seek interpretation of dreams. The Aramaic fragments contain partial lines that may correspond to similar activity. The Qumran text, however, preserves only brief references rather than full narrative arcs. Comparative analysis relies on names rather than extensive parallel phrasing. Some fragments contain numerical expressions. Because the text is damaged, the exact numbers remain uncertain. Scholars identify traces of numerals but refrain from reconstructing complete figures. In apocalyptic literature of the period, numerical symbolism often carries interpretive weight. The Book of Giants fragments do not preserve sufficient context to confirm symbolic function. Editors therefore present the surviving digits without extended commentary. Material evidence indicates multiple manuscript copies. Variants in spelling and spacing suggest independent transmission within the Qumran community. The presence of more than one copy implies circulation rather than accidental preservation. Stuckenbrook notes that at least 6 distinct manuscripts from Cave 4 contain portions of the Book of Giants. This multiplicity supports the view that the text was read and recopied alongside other Enochic works. Comparative literary analysis situates the Book of Giants within Second Temple apocalyptic tradition. It shares thematic elements with 1 Enoch and Jubilees, both attested at Qumran. The giant's anxiety over judgment parallels the Watcher's petition in 1 Enoch 13. However, the Book of Giants shifts focus from fallen angels to their offspring. This narrative emphasis is documented through preserved names and dream reports rather than inferred speculation. The Aramaic fragments also preserve formulaic expressions typical of visionary literature. Phrases equivalent to "I saw in my dream" appear in partial form. The grammatical construction mirrors other Qumran Aramaic texts. Such linguistic parallels support classification within the Enochic corpus. George W. E. Nicholsberg and James C. Flashtree. Van der Kam have both noted these similarities in their studies of Enochic traditions. Textual lacunae remain extensive. No fragment preserves a beginning or conclusion. No continuous column survives intact. The text known as the Book of Giants at Qumran exists as a constellation of voices and names rather than a complete manuscript. Editors avoid reconstructing narrative beyond verifiable joins and linguistic parallels. Modern editions present each fragment individually before proposing composite arrangements. High-resolution images from the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls digital library allow direct examination of ink traces. Scholars can observe stroke thickness and letter curvature. Some fragments reveal faint diagonal scratches used by scribes to guide writing lines. These technical features confirm that the manuscripts were professionally copied, rather than hastily written notes. The script style aligns with other formal Qumran manuscripts of the period. Secondary scholarship continues to refine readings. Advances in multispectral imaging occasionally clarify letters previously deemed illegible. Revised transcriptions appear in academic journals and updated editions. Each adjustment is documented with photographic reference. The process remains incremental and evidence-based. The community that preserved the manuscripts. Stone walls and plastered pools define the plateau at Khirbet Qumran, where excavations uncovered the settlement associated with the nearby caves. The site sits above the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, bordered by desert cliffs and seasonal wadis. Roland Deveau directed excavations between 1951 and 1956, documenting communal rooms, stepped water installations, pottery kilns, and a cemetery extending east of the main complex. The material culture recovered from the settlement provides context for the manuscripts found in the caves, including the fragments later identified as the Book of Giants. The architectural layout suggests organized communal activity. Deveau interpreted several rooms as scriptoria, based on the discovery of inkwells and benches. Subsequent scholarship has debated that interpretation, yet the presence of writing implements remains documented. 2 inkwells were found in Locus 30 during excavation, described in Devoe's field reports. Whether or not this room functioned exclusively for copying manuscripts, the site contained the tools necessary for scribal work. Pottery forms discovered at Qumran match jars found in Cave 1 and other caves, linking the settlement materially to the storage of scrolls. Manuscripts preserved in the caves reflect a range of genres: biblical texts, sectarian rules, apocalyptic compositions, and rewritten scripture. The Book of Giants fragments, written in Aramaic, belong to the non-biblical category often termed para-biblical literature. The diversity of manuscripts indicates that the community's collection was not limited to a single type of writing. The Community Rule 1QS, the Damascus Document CD, and the War Scroll 1QM demonstrate structured communal ideology. Alongside these, Enochic texts circulated in multiple copies. Scholarly identification of the Qumran community has frequently connected the settlement with the Essenes described by ancient authors. Flavius Josephus, in The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, records the existence of Essene groups living communally and sharing property. Philo of Alexandria and Pliny the Elder also describe Essenes residing near the Dead Sea. Pliny situates them on the west of the Dead Sea, away from the coast, a description that aligns geographically with Qumran. While direct identification remains debated, the convergence of literary and archaeological data supports the presence of an organized Jewish group at the site during the late Second Temple period. Ceramic typology from Qumran indicates occupation from the 2nd century BCE through the 1st century CE. Coins recovered from excavation layers provide additional chronological markers. These include Hasmonean and early Roman issues. Stratigraphic analysis shows destruction layers corresponding to the Roman campaign in 68 CE, recorded by Josephus during the First Jewish Revolt. After this event, the site was largely abandoned. The preservation of manuscripts in nearby caves appears deliberate. Scroll jars from Cave 1 and fragments in Cave 4 suggest that texts were stored intentionally rather than discarded. The Book of Giants fragments, like other Aramaic manuscripts, were discovered in Cave 4's debris layer. Archaeological reports describe the fragments as scattered across the cave floor rather than enclosed in jars. The cause of this distribution remains uncertain. Some scholars propose that looting or natural collapse contributed to the fragmentation. The sectarian texts from Qumran express concern with purity, covenant fidelity, and eschatological expectation. Although the Book of Giants is not a sectarian rule document, its themes of judgment and divine decree align with apocalyptic interests evident in other manuscripts. The community's copying of multiple Enochic texts suggests sustained engagement with that tradition. James C. Vanderkam notes that the presence of Aramaic Enochic literature at Qumran predates later Hebrew sectarian compositions, indicating that these writings were valued independently of local doctrinal developments. Excavation records maintained by DeVoe and later reassessed by scholars such as Jody Magness provide detailed descriptions of water installations and communal facilities. The stepped pools were interpreted as ritual baths, consistent with practices of purity observed in other Jewish contexts. The integration of ritual infrastructure and manuscript preservation reflects a structured communal environment rather than an isolated refuge. Manuscript evidence shows scribal variation across copies of the Book of Giants and other texts. Differences in handwriting indicate multiple scribes working over time. Frank Moorcross's paleographic typology places several Qumran scripts within identifiable chronological phases. Such analysis supports the conclusion that manuscript production occurred over decades rather than during a single copying event. The cemetery east of the settlement contains over 1,000 graves, oriented predominantly north to south. Anthropological examination reveals adult male predominance, though women and children are also present in smaller numbers. The burial pattern has been cited in discussions of communal identity. While the cemetery does not provide direct evidence regarding the Book of Giants, it contributes to understanding the social context in which manuscripts were preserved. Debate continues regarding whether Qumran functioned as a primary scribal center or as a repository for texts brought from elsewhere. Some scholars argue that manuscripts were copied in Jerusalem and later stored at Qumran during periods of unrest. Others maintain that internal scribal activity occurred at the settlement itself. The discovery of inkwells and evidence of writing surfaces supports at least some level of local production. The multiplicity of Enochic manuscripts, including several copies of the Book of Giants, indicates intentional preservation within the community's textual collection. Environmental conditions along the Dead Sea facilitated manuscript survival. Low humidity and minimal rainfall reduced organic decay. The caves provided stable microclimates shielded from direct sunlight. Geological surveys of the Marl Cliffs describe cavities formed by erosion, creating natural storage spaces. These physical factors, combined with deliberate placement, allowed parchment and papyrus to survive for over 2 millennia. Suppression, canon, and the limits of acceptance. Lists determine memory. When religious communities defined which writings were to be read publicly and copied for instruction, they also defined which texts would circulate widely and which would remain peripheral. The Book of Giants does not appear in any known ancient Jewish canon list. Its absence from later rabbinic literature and from early Christian canonical catalogues marks a shift in authority rather than a single documented act of rejection. Jewish canon formation unfolded over several centuries. The Torah held fixed authority by the Persian period. Prophetic and other writings achieved recognition gradually. By the 1st century CE, many Jewish groups treated the law and the prophets as stable collections. Josephus, writing in Against Apion, refers to 22 sacred books recognized among the Jews. His enumeration does not include works such as 1 Enoch or the Book of Giants. Josephus describes prophetic succession as having ceased after the time of Artaxerxes, implying that later writings did not share the same status as earlier scripture. Rabbinic literature composed after the destruction of the Jerusalem Temple reflects a narrowed scriptural focus. The Mishnah and later the Babylonian Talmud cite Torah and prophetic books extensively. They refer occasionally to external works but do not preserve the Enochic corpus. Discussions of Genesis 6 appear in tractates such as Sanhedrin, where debates concern the identity of the sons of God. The Book of Giants narrative, as preserved at Qumran, is not cited. This silence suggests that Enochic expansions did not carry forward into mainstream rabbinic teaching. The situation differs in early Christian contexts. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament quotes 1 Enoch 1-9 explicitly. Church fathers such as Tertullian acknowledged Enochic material, though not universally. Tertullian, in On the Apparel of Women, defended the authority of 1 Enoch while recognizing that it was not accepted by all communities. By the 4th century, canonical lists such as those of Athanasius excluded Enochic literature from the New Testament canon. The Book of Giants, lacking a complete Greek or Latin version, did not enter these debates in direct form. Canon formation involved criteria including apostolic authorship, liturgical usage, and doctrinal consistency. Texts that circulated widely in Greek or Latin translations had greater opportunity for inclusion. The Book of Giants survived in Aramaic at Qumran and later in Middle Iranian among Manichaean communities. It did not achieve widespread Greek translation. The absence of a Greek recension limited its integration into early Christian scriptural discussion. Manichaean adoption altered the text's reception history. Christian heresiologists such as Augustine and Epiphanius described Manichaean teachings critically. In Against Faustus, Augustine critiques Manichaean cosmology and scriptural claims. Because the Book of Giants circulated within Manichaean communities, later Christian authorities would have associated it with heterodox tradition. This association may have reinforced its exclusion from Christian canonical consideration. Jewish communities after the 1st century CE also reoriented textual authority around emerging rabbinic leadership. The Hebrew Bible's stabilization in consonantal form, and later vocalization in the Masoretic tradition, focused transmission on a defined corpus. Texts not included in this corpus lacked institutional copying networks. Without sustained scribal reproduction, manuscripts could disappear. The survival of the Book of Giants at Qumran represents preservation within one community rather than broad endorsement. Archaeological evidence supports the limited geographic spread of the Book of Giants in Jewish contexts. All confirmed Jewish Aramaic fragments derive from Cave 4 at Qumran. No fragments have been identified in Masada, Murabba'at, or other Judean desert sites where biblical and sectarian texts have been recovered. The confinement of physical evidence to a single site indicates restricted distribution. The Ethiopic Church preserved 1 Enoch as canonical scripture. However, no Ethiopic translation of the Book of Giants has been documented. The absence of translation suggests that the text was not transmitted along the same pathways as other Enochic works. James C. Van der Kam notes that the Ethiopic Enoch tradition likely drew on Greek intermediaries rather than directly on Aramaic manuscripts. Without Greek translation, the Book of Giants lacked a channel into that tradition. Medieval Jewish polemical literature occasionally references apocryphal works, but does not cite the Book of Giants. Manuscript inventories from the Cairo Geniza, catalogued by Solomon Schechter and later scholars, have yielded numerous biblical and rabbinic texts but no identifiable fragments of this composition. The Geniza corpus demonstrates the breadth of medieval Jewish textual preservation. Its silence regarding the Book of Giants reinforces the limited transmission beyond Qumran. Modern rediscovery altered scholarly awareness rather than historical status. The publication of the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that Second Temple Judaism encompassed literary diversity broader than later canonical boundaries suggest. Yet historical canon formation decisions remain documented through ancient testimony rather than inferred suppression. There is no record of a formal decree banning the Book of Giants. Its disappearance from Jewish and Christian scriptural collections reflects processes of selection and copying rather than documented prohibition. The Book of Giants did not enter the canonized collections that shaped Jewish and Christian scripture. Its preservation depended on communities that valued it within specific interpretive frameworks. The documentary record shows inclusion in some circles and absence in others, reflecting historical processes of textual authority rather than singular acts of suppression. Rediscovery in the 20th century scholarly world. Wooden crates in Jerusalem, Berlin, and Amman held fragments that few scholars outside a small editorial circle had seen. The modern reintroduction of the Book of Giants into academic discussion unfolded gradually, shaped by excavation logistics, political upheaval, and editorial policy. Public knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls expanded in stages, and the fragments associated with the Book of Giants followed that same pattern of controlled release. After the initial discoveries near Qumran in 1947, the Jordanian Department of Antiquities assumed responsibility for many of the scroll fragments recovered from subsequent excavations. An international team of scholars, convened under the supervision of Roland Deveau, began cataloguing and editing Cave 4 materials in the 1950s. Access to unpublished fragments remained limited to members of this team for decades. Photographs circulated internally, but comprehensive publication moved slowly. Joseph T. Milik played a central role in identifying the Book of Giants fragments among the Cave 4 Aramaic texts. His proposals, circulated in lectures and preliminary articles during the 1960s, established a working classification. Milik's major publication, The Books of Enoch, Aramaic Fragments of Qumran Cave 4, 1976, included transcriptions of fragments attributed to the Book of Giants. Even then, not all material was fully published, and some readings depended on photographs not widely distributed. Academic frustration regarding limited access intensified during the 1980s. Scholars outside the editorial team argued that the long delay hindered progress. In 1991, the Huntington Library in California announced that it possessed a set of photographic negatives of the Dead Sea Scrolls, including Cave 4 fragments, and made them available to qualified researchers. This action significantly expanded scholarly access. Soon after, the Israel Antiquities Authority permitted broader consultation of scroll photographs. These developments allowed independent verification of earlier transcriptions. The official publication series Discoveries in the Judean Desert accelerated in the 1990s and early 2000s. Volumes containing Aramaic texts were released with diplomatic transcriptions and plate photographs. Lauren T. Stuckenbrook's monograph, The Book of Giants from Qumran, 1997, synthesized the available fragments into a comprehensive critical edition. His work incorporated revised readings based on direct examination of the fragments and improved imaging techniques. Parallel rediscovery occurred within Manichaean studies. Walter Bruno Henning's 1943 article had already identified Middle Persian fragments from Turfan as part of a Manichaean Book of Giants. Subsequent research by Werner Sundermann and other scholars expanded the corpus of Iranian fragments. As Qumran materials became accessible, comparative analysis confirmed that the Aramaic fragments represented an earlier stage of the same narrative tradition. The connection between Judean desert and Central Asian manuscripts reshaped scholarly understanding of transmission pathways. Technological developments influenced interpretation. Multispectral imaging, introduced in Dead Sea Scroll research during the late 20th century, enhanced legibility of faded ink. Laboratories affiliated with the Israel Antiquities Authority applied non-invasive imaging to clarify previously uncertain letters. Revised readings occasionally altered identification of names or verbs in the Book of Giants fragments. Updated transcriptions appeared in academic journals and revised editions. Public exhibitions also contributed to awareness. Selected fragments were displayed in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem and in travelling exhibitions organised by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Exhibition catalogues included descriptions of non-biblical texts, though the Book of Giants rarely appeared prominently due to its fragmentary condition. Nonetheless, references in catalogue essays introduced the composition to a broader audience. Scholarly conferences dedicated to Enochic literature and Second Temple Judaism incorporated new findings. Papers presented at meetings of the Society of Biblical Literature and related organizations addressed the Book of Giants in relation to apocalyptic tradition. Comparative studies examined narrative parallels with 1 Enoch and Manichaean cosmology. Peer-reviewed publications ensured that discussion rested on documented manuscript evidence. Digitization initiatives transformed access in the 21st century. The Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, launched by the Israel Antiquities Authority in 2012, made high-resolution images of scroll fragments publicly accessible. Researchers could examine the Book of Giants fragments directly online, zooming into individual letters, Metadata accompanying each image includes cave designation, material description, and paleographic dating. Editorial transparency increased alongside digital access. Critical apparatus in published volumes identifies uncertain letters, lacunae, and proposed restorations. Earlier conjectures are occasionally revised in light of clearer images. Scholarly debate continues in academic journals, focusing on philological precision rather than speculative reconstruction. The rediscovery of the Book of Giants in modern scholarship did not create new textual content. It clarified and contextualized fragmentary evidence already present in archival collections. Publication delays, access controversies, and technological limitations shaped the pace of interpretation. Once photographs became widely available, independent scholars confirmed, corrected, and expanded earlier editorial work. Modern awareness of the Book of Giants rests on the combined efforts of archaeologists, philologists, conservators, and digital archivists. Fragmentary Aramaic leaves recovered from Cave 4 and Iranian manuscripts preserved in Turfan collections now occupy a defined place in scholarly literature, accessible through published editions and digital repositories. The surviving text and its place in documented history. The Book of Giants survives as parchment fibers, ink traces, catalogue numbers, and published transcriptions. It does not exist today as a bound volume, nor as a continuous scroll displayed in a museum case. Its modern form is assembled from fragments preserved in controlled storage, photographed, measured, transcribed, and compared. Its place in documented history rests not on legend, but on material evidence, editorial process, and sustained academic study spanning more than a century. The Aramaic fragments discovered in Cave 4 near Qumran constitute the earliest known witnesses to the composition. Paleographic analysis places these manuscripts within the late Second Temple period. Radiocarbon testing conducted on comparable Cave 4 materials supports that time frame. The fragments include multiple manuscript copies, indicating that the composition circulated within the community responsible for the Qumran collection. Catalogue numbers such as 4Q203 and 4Q530 through 4Q533 identify individual fragments or sets of fragments attributed to the Book of Giants. These designations appear in the official Discoveries in the Judean Desert volumes and in the digital archives maintained by the Israel Antiquities Authority. Within the surviving Aramaic lines, names such as Mahaway, Oya, and Haya recur. The text preserves speech fragments, dream reports, and references to written messages delivered by or associated with Enoch. The giants appear as speaking figures who recount visions and consult one another regarding their meaning. The role of Enoch aligns with his function in other Enochic literature preserved at Qumran. Although no complete narrative sequence survives, the recurring elements allow classification within the broader Enochic tradition. The Book of Giants does not appear in the later Hebrew Bible canon. It is absent from rabbinic compilations such as the Mishnah and Talmud. Early Christian canon lists similarly exclude it. Its transmission outside the Judean desert is documented primarily through Manichaean sources recovered in Central Asia. Middle Persian and Parthian fragments discovered during German and Russian expeditions to Turfan preserve a related narrative. Walter Bruno Henning's analysis in the mid-20th century identified parallels between these Manichaean fragments and the Qumran Aramaic text. Later scholarship by Lauren T. Stuckenbrook and others confirmed that the Qumran material represents an earlier stage of the same tradition. The Manichaean versions demonstrate adaptation. Names correspond across languages, though spelling shifts reflect phonetic systems of Middle Iranian. The Iranian fragments incorporate theological vocabulary consistent with Mani's dualistic cosmology. The Aramaic Qumran fragments lack that vocabulary, indicating that Manichaean editors reshaped inherited material. This layered transmission illustrates how religious communities adapted earlier narratives while preserving recognizable structural components. Archaeological context grounds the Book of Giants within the Qumran manuscript collection. Excavations directed by Roland Deveau documented the settlement and its associated caves. Ceramic analysis and coin evidence situate occupation within the 2nd century BCE through the 1st century CE. The caves yielded biblical, sectarian, and apocalyptic manuscripts. The Book of Giants fragments form part of that corpus. Their preservation depended on deliberate storage within cave environments characterized by low humidity and limited light exposure. Scientific verification strengthens historical placement. Paleographic comparison situates the script within established chronological typologies. Radiocarbon testing of related manuscripts aligns with those typologies. Ink analysis confirms use of carbon-based composition typical of the period. Parchment fiber analysis supports ancient production techniques. Chain of custody documentation traces fragments from excavation through archival storage. These converging lines of evidence establish authenticity. Modern access to the fragments expanded gradually. Publication delays during the 20th century limited early scholarship. Access controversies in the early 1990s led to broader release of photographic materials. The Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls digital library now provides high-resolution images of many fragments, including those attributed to the Book of Giants. Scholars worldwide can examine ink traces directly, verifying published transcriptions. The Book of Giants occupies a defined category within academic classification. It is considered parabiblical or apocalyptic literature from the Second Temple period. It expands on themes introduced in Genesis 6, focusing on the giants rather than solely on the Watchers. It shares linguistic and thematic features with other Aramaic Enochic compositions. It does not function as scripture within Jewish or Christian canon, but it contributes to understanding literary diversity during the late Hellenistic and early Roman eras. Comparative literature studies situate the Book of Giants alongside other works that elaborate on early Genesis traditions. The Genesis Apocryphon from Cave 1 retells patriarchal narratives in Aramaic. The Book of Jubilees restructures biblical chronology. The Book of Watchers expands angelic descent traditions. Within this environment, the Book of Giants represents a focused narrative strand addressing the perspective of the giants themselves. Its fragmentary state limits reconstruction, yet recurring names and themes confirm its distinct identity. Scholarly methodology emphasizes restraint. Editors mark lacunae clearly. Conjectural restorations are bracketed. Uncertain letters receive dotted notation. This transparent approach reflects standard philological practice. The Book of Giants has not been reconstructed into a continuous speculative narrative. Academic editions present fragments as fragments, allowing readers to assess evidence directly. The composition's disappearance from mainstream canon did not result from documented prohibition. Rather, it reflects historical processes of selection, copying, and transmission. Texts preserved in liturgical settings and translated into dominant languages survived. Those confined to limited communities risked loss. The Book of Giants survived in Qumran caves and later in Manichaean communities. Outside those contexts, its presence diminished. The rediscovery of the fragments in the 20th century reintroduced the composition into scholarly discourse. Comparative studies between Qumran and Turfan manuscripts revealed cross-cultural transmission pathways linking Jewish apocalyptic literature with Central Asian religious movements. This discovery broadened understanding of textual mobility across regions connected by trade and migration. Material evidence, editorial publication, and digital accessibility collectively define the Book of Giants' place in documented history. It is not a complete book, but a reconstructed textual entity grounded in identifiable manuscripts. Its historical significance lies in its contribution to the study of Second Temple Judaism, apocalyptic literature, and the interaction between Jewish and Manichaean traditions. The surviving text demonstrates that literary production during the late Second Temple period extended beyond later canonical boundaries. The Qumran collection preserved a range of compositions reflecting interpretive engagement with scripture. The Book of Giants forms part of that record. Its presence among multiple copies indicates readership and value within at least one community. The Iranian fragments confirm continued life of the narrative beyond Judea. Adaptation within Manichaean tradition illustrates how texts could migrate and transform. The preservation of recognizable names across languages documents continuity, even amid theological reshaping. This transmission pattern contributes to broader studies of religious interaction in late antiquity. The Book of Giants today exists in scholarly editions, digital archives, and academic discussion. It is cited in research on Enochic literature and on the diversity of Jewish thought before the rise of rabbinic and Christian orthodoxy. Its fragmentary nature requires cautious interpretation. Every line depends on preserved ink and documented reading. Historical placement rests on measurable data, archaeological context, paleographic dating, radiocarbon calibration, ink composition, material analysis, and comparative philology. These elements provide a stable foundation. The Book of Giants remains a subject of research rather than devotional reading. Its authority derives from evidence, not from institutional canon. The fragments attributed to the Book of Giants continue to be examined through emerging technologies. Multispectral imaging refines legibility. Digital concordances assist in identifying lexical parallels. Conservation science stabilizes fragile material. Each development adds precision to existing knowledge without altering the fundamental fragmentary condition of the text. The narrative voice preserved within the fragments remains limited to brief speeches and dream reports. No concluding passage survives. No complete column has been recovered. The Book of Giants is known through what remains rather than through what once existed in full. Its documented history spans ancient copying in Judea, storage in desert caves, rediscovery in the mid-20th century, and comparative study linking Central Asian manuscripts with Aramaic fragments. This trajectory is supported by physical artifacts and published scholarship. It illustrates how text can traverse geography and time while leaving only partial material evidence. The Book of Giants stands within documented history as an authenticated Second Temple composition, preserved in fragments, transmitted across cultures, excluded from canon, and restored to academic awareness through archaeology and philology. Its existence is confirmed by measurable evidence. Its content is defined by surviving lines. Its significance rests in its contribution to understanding the literary and religious landscape of ancient Judaism and its later adaptations. If you found this fascinating, subscribe and stay with us as we uncover more hidden texts and forgotten history. Leave a comment with your thoughts and share this with someone who loves this kind of video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.